Alright, Victorum Gaming fans, we're back. We've got another SPQR video today. We're going to take a look at Macedonia, which is actually the faction that we are playing for, primarily playing for SPQR. So you get the usual history, sort of the origins of the Macedonians, army, composition, all that stuff. Really neat if you're not familiar with it. So on the hero side, as normal, jumping right in. So ours is a 50 denarii hero, base cost. Range 1, melee 2, 2 melee dice, 2 agility, plus 3 bravery to start with, no armor because it doesn't come with equipment, and then there's the typical 2 wounds. So really cool right off the bat, especially with that plus 3 bravery. Again, probably more representing that the reforms and all that from Philip and then Alexander. So really cool options here too. Pretty typical as we're getting back more towards Greek armies here. Our Greek-like armies, a large shield. You got the Linothorax option, will probably be your most common one just because it's solid armor for cheap. Cuirass, helmet, if you want to go super cheap on the armor. Cuirass, of course, is like the super heavy option there. Long spear as well, and a sword there. So again, all very cheaply costed. You can give them a sling too, but again, unless you're going to specifically kit that hero out to be a ranged hero, really wouldn't bother with that. You can also give them some javelins, and then the horse for us, for some reason, costs 40 denarii. That's fine, but still worth considering that for at least 1 or 2 cavalry heroes, just because Macedonia does have access to some really cool cavalry for this game. So long spear, of course, really probably more if you're going to be putting the hero in a either like a Royal Guard unit or the Pezatai just something to consider there. Yeah, pretty easy options for upgrading there. So unless you're really building a super heavy defense unit that will also have cuirasses, yeah, you don't necessarily need that. It's going to slow you down a whole lot. Of course, unless you go and buy the horse on top of it, then you got some really awesome protection there. So typical build will probably be like Linothorax, a sword, and the shield. And then again, if you're going into basically one of the pike units, you might consider the long spear, or possibly the horse, depending on what you're doing there. So that is the hero, and again, really solid across the board, especially starting with that plus 3 bravery. So that will be a good factor for the Macedonians. Moving on to our Royal Guard unit here. So we start with move 6, ranged plus 2, plus 3 melee, 2 melee dice, plus 2 agility, plus 2 bravery, 1 armor, 1 wound. You know, kind of like your super elite unit here. Again, not the crazy 2 wounds base of the Imperial Roman Praetorians, but also only 20 denarii here. And that 20 already brings you a helmet, a large shield, a long spear, and a sword. And you got some interesting options with these guys. So these guys can be kind of like a light pike unit. You can take them and basically be a more elite version of them if you want to go a little bit heavier on the armor. Alternately, you can actually turn these guys into a missile unit. And then along with that, if you're keeping them relatively light and basically not buying them any extra armor, these guys have basically an infiltration rule, which we'll cover in just a second. So it's really kind of like a super elite unit that can actually be kind of a toolbox and be used for various things. So if you give them Linothoraxes, that gives you your typical armor. That'll replace the helmet, plus 2 in your armor. If you want to go sort of super heavy, elite, but it's fairly slow, cuirasses for another 10, and then even then it's still actually a pretty good bargain. Only 30 denarii there. You know, then you have some other options here. So you got the long spears to start with, which are pretty good. But if you want to go all in on the ranged option, basically, and not upgrade your armor, you can swap long spears for bows for free. You can also swap them for slings for free if you want really solid slingers. And again, if you keep them light, you can use the infiltrated rule below. Alternately, you could sort of set up like a really heavily armored bow or sling unit too. So you can also upgrade the long spears into pikes, but that will cost you 5 denarii, so that part's not free. But then that will basically make them a much better version of the regular Pezatai. And then last but not least, you can get a horn for these guys. Interesting, no standard. So that may or may not be a factor there, but certainly the horn, of course, is a worthwhile purchase. So infiltrators, as we talked about a couple or mentioned to or alluded to a few times here. So when all forces have been deployed, but before the first turn begins, a hypaspist, which is another name for these guys, a unit that has not purchased linothoraxes or cuirasses may perform 2 move actions. So, again, as long as you're not buying that extra armor, and whether you have these guys equipped for close combat or ranged or whatever, basically these guys will get 2 free moves. So, and since they won't be weighed down by armor, it will be 2 6-inch moves. So, that can really get you in a pretty advantageous spot, maybe early in the game. And again, depending on the mission, if you got to grab some pretty far off objectives, these guys almost can start potentially pretty close to the middle of the field here. So really interesting rule there. And again, it just depends on how you equip these guys and how you want to take advantage of that. Alternately, if you're moving them up and they're more geared for combat, the enemy's got to deal with a pretty nasty, pretty skilled combat unit. But again, that lighter armor will be a bit of a risk there. And again, 20 denarii a pop is not cheap. But ultimately, you can also sit back with these guys, maybe infiltrate and go the ranged option too. So, however, if there are 10 or more of them, they can also make use of the phalanx rule, so something else to consider there. Interesting to note too, again, if you replace the long spears, you do still have a sword and a large shield, so they're not necessarily giving up all of their combat ability there. It's just the long spear obviously has some benefits over other weapons that aren't long. So yeah, so again, interesting things to consider here. So lots of potential options and uses for the Royal Guard. Then we come to our typical standard unit here, which will be the Pesityroi. So basically our foot companions. Clocks in at 16 denarii base. Range is 1, but we can really ignore that. Melee 2, 2 melee dice, 1 agility, standard 2 bravery for us. And they come with a large shield and a pike, so no extra armor or anything just yet. So you can give them linothoraxes, which is pretty typical there. Just some solid armor without necessarily slowing them down too much. If you want to go that super heavy route, you do have that option for 10 denarii for a cuirass. Takes a 26 a pop, and you're going to have some really solid armor, but you're also going to be super slow. So depending on the size of the game and the battles and all that stuff and missions, that could be a really cool unit. It's definitely going to have some staying power, but again, you're not really going to get anywhere fast, so something to consider there. If you want to go super light on the armor, you just have the helmet option there, but again, kind of questionable, I feel. So it's really more of your comfort level there. Because again, if you do end up losing a round of combat, the pikes are useless, so then you're stuck with fists. So really, a typical upgrade is also going to be buying those swords for 3 denarii. So again, you're adding points there as well. But nonetheless, a very light unit of these guys with the shields and the pikes could maybe get some work done. They do have the option for a standard and a horn, although here for whatever reason, they decided to write it out of the normal order here. I'm not sure what's going on there. Usually they put the horn first, but not a big deal. And again, they have the option for forming a phalanx. So for myself, whenever I run these guys, my typical upgrades really for them are, again, just going with the linothorax pretty much across the board. And then if they're going to be more of the sort of frontline units, I definitely spend that time and get the swords for them too, just so that if somehow they actually do lose a round of fighting, although they haven't really lost many, if at all, the swords will give you that extra parry and give you another actual weapon to use instead of hands and fists. So that is the Pesityroi unit, again, our basic standard infantry unit, and really just an awesome unit if used well. Again, if you're in phalanx, again, we'll talk about that when we cover other special rules and stuff in the game, but the Achilles heel of that is basically getting charged in the flank or in the rear, or having other enemy units or abilities that have ways of negating it, like we saw with the Iberians. So just something to be aware of. Then we come to our cavalry unit, which is just the Hetairoi, the famous companion cavalry of Alexander. So 26 denarii, plus 2 melee, 2 melee dice, plus 2 bravery, a little bit of armor there, and the 2 wounds typical for the cavalry. Comes basically with the horse, the linothorax, and the long spear and sword there. So I think because they're not so much consistent in the book, so I think it actually should be plus 3 on the armor, right? 1 for the horse and 2 for the linothorax. We'll have to go back and double check that. But sometimes they factor in the actual armor on the stat, and then sometimes they leave it off, and you have to actually add it. So, but something to consider there. But anyway, really good cavalry. So we can also replace the linothorax with cuirasses for 10 denarii, and still a reasonable cost there. And basically it takes them to really more heavy cavalry territory. The long spears, of course, awesome on the charge. You could also give these guys barding and sort of transform them into cataphracts, and really that's more, even though this army is more around the time of Philip and Alexander, cataphracts really came later with the various successor armies, but they give you that option here, and Warlord does make the models for it, which are also really awesome for both flavors of that. You can also give these guys some javelins, which, again, maybe a bit questionable. Really, the bread and butter of these guys is getting in and charging and just really wasting enemy units. You do have the option for the horn and standard as typical here. Certainly the horn is almost like a mandatory upgrade, again getting an extra action once per game, and then combining that with the Flight of Cranes ability here, which is basically unique to this army. So if Hetairoi charge an enemy unit and inflict more casualties than they suffer in that action, which ideally you should be out damaging your opponent, they may perform an immediate and free move or melee action without fleeing from combat. Simply move them out of contact with any remaining enemy. So if you charge in and you didn't do as hot as you needed to, or you just really actually want to free yourself up for other movement in future turns, you don't want to get stuck in with that enemy, you can bounce back out, make them waste an action to get to you as well. Ultimately, following up with another free attack can also just be absolutely brutal, especially when these guys are led with like a properly kitted out hero for cavalry. They just get that much better. And certainly that extra round of combat, you could certainly keep using the long spears for the extra like benefit of +1 if you basically have +1 to your melee if you have basically if they don't have long weapons as well, or ultimately you switch to the sword for the parries. Again, really solid armor. Again, certainly whether it's the linothorax or you go kind of heavier on the cuirass. Cataphract option, haven't really played with that version of these guys yet, but a little bit questionable. I think it's all about speed really with these guys. But nonetheless, again, cataphracts really, you've got mobile tanks basically. The big thing to point out though, again, these guys do not have shields of any kind, so your ability to parry is a little bit more questionable, and you're going to be relying more on your armor. So that's why I really feel like it's more, these guys are better suited to basically just getting in there, getting that charge, doing all the damage they possibly can, which often can wipe out a unit. And if not, really you can follow up with another free round of combat if you haven't taken too much damage in return, or if you need to just bounce out. But again, these guys can do well on their own, but certainly like they just become absolutely crazy if you get a properly tooled up and decently leveled up hero to lead these guys. Or of course, if you're leading them with one of those 2 special characters, which we'll cover in a bit. So Hetairoi cavalry, really awesome. Definitely should be a part of your army along with the Hetairoi. And then Macedonia has, again, a really great selection of units too. So they make use of various missile units. So we have our Peltasts clocking in at 7 denarii, +2 ranged. So really cool there. Without having to dip into mercenaries, having a +2 on the ranged is really nice. Then just 1 melee dice, 1 agility, 1 bravery. Again, these guys aren't meant to be close combat fighters. Comes with 1 javelin and a small shield. You can buy some more javelins, which again certainly would recommend. That's kind of what these guys are about. So I would go max on that. So basically 11 denarii apiece. You can give them helmets if you feel like you need that little bit of armor. Again, kind of questionable. I feel like just more guys is going to do more for you than having a really weak armor save. Swords, if you do want that ability to, maybe get into combat a little bit and actually do more, do a little bit of work. Again, only +1 melee and 1 dice apiece. These guys are not going to tackle anything that can really fight back. But if you have the sword and the small shield, that gives you some parry action in combat. But again, your lack of armor is really going to be the tail there. But they can get the job done necessarily with a solid numbers in the unit and stuff like that. But I would go for size and just max javelins here, and then if you do need to follow up, I guess you could. The horn could be well worth it too, just to get yourself into either an extra really good position with like an extra move once per game, or really if you got yourself into a great position where you just wanted to throw an extra javelin, if you still have some. So that could be really interesting. Hit and run as well. So again, if you go that close combat option, but again, that's a bit risky. But nonetheless, so of the first of the two real missile units for the Macedonians here, they definitely have their uses. So, but I feel like it's more about sticking with just massive javelins with these guys, and taking advantage of that just all natural +2 ranged here. So that's pretty good for a regular unit that isn't one of the special mercenaries or anything. So keep that in mind. Our other unit, which in my army so far I've made great use of, is the Siloi. So they clock in at a super cheap 4 denarii. And basically, these guys are your other missile troop. So only range 1, melee 1, 1 dice, no agility, 1 bravery, no armor. They come with a dagger and stones, which I suppose you could certainly build up a horde of these guys and try to use them that way. But really, I feel like for only 2 denarii, you're getting bows out of these guys. Now, they're not going to be great with that range +1, but for 6 denarii apiece, it's really easy to accumulate a sizable quantity of those to make up for the sort of not so great skill with the bow. And you'll get your damage in that way. You could also transform these guys into peltists, essentially, although not quite as good, but they get the javelins for 1 denarii apiece. So if you left these guys as is and bought the 3 javelins, they clock in at 7 denarii with 3 javelins, whereas that's the base cost of a peltist with 1. So, some interesting number crunching to consider there. You do have the option of going sort of extra long range with these guys if you wanted to drop the stones with and replace them with slings. You're only 8 denarii there, and you get that awesome 30-inch range. So again, another possible use for these guys. You do have the option of going a little bit into close combat with these guys if you want to go swords for 3 denarii and animal skins or bucklers for 2 each. So if you want to get like a little bit of armor, again, light, close combat ability, while still being fairly cheap, you can go that route too. Buying the swords and the either the skins or the bucklers, whatever. You can basically still keep this under 10 denarii, but again, and they have hit and run just like the peltists. But again, I feel like the focus really here has to be on the missile abilities first. And really, if you're doing your job between your cavalry and your pikemen and all that, that should be where your damage is coming from. These guys really are just there to clean up things with missiles or soften them up with missiles. Relying on these guys to do the combat for you is probably not the smartest of plans here. But anyway, that's both these guys. Some definite similarities here, but also some clear differences. Personally, I pretty much run all of mine with bows right now, and basically like large units of like 15 to 20, which is still not a lot of points, and then just relying on numbers. And a lot of times the opponents tend to think these guys are deadlier than they are, so they try to avoid that massive missiles, even though they're only hitting on 5s at best. But the presence of that many missiles potentially does have a psychological effect, at least on a lot of people I've played so far. So again, really cool unit. Then we get a a little bit more, sort of a hybrid of things here. So they're called the Thuriophoroi. They clock in at 11 denarii apiece. They start with range +2. Again, another interesting stat there. Only one melee and one dice, but they come with an agility, a bravery, and an armor. And that is basically because they have a helmet as standard, one javelin. They come with a long spear and a small shield, so some combat ability there, very light missile ability, but here's where we get a little bit crazy with the upgrades. So what do you really want this unit to be? They can do hit and run, and they can also do phalanx, basically. So, but you have to do some upgrades for these guys first. So again, there's a whole host of things to possibly consider here. So if we stick with basically upgrading on the missile side, you can give them more javelins for 2 apiece, which is fairly reasonable. And again, range +2, they should be hitting fairly often with these javelins. Now you could give them swords too if you want to get that extra parry action going for combat. You can give them a standards and a horn. Those options are there. But then they have a little upgrade tucked at the back end here, which really transformed this unit from this kind of like light combat skirmisher type unit into kind of a medium-ish light version of the foot companions, the Pesitirae. So you can upgrade a whole unit to Thoricatai with chainmail shirts for 10 denarii. No other upgrades or any stat changes or anything like that. And so for 21 denarii, you're getting chainmail armor, which again, really awesome. Will make them a little bit slower, but just great armor. Only the small shield though, and here I feel like if you're going that route, you might as well get the swords too. But at that point, they're clocking in at basically like Roman legionary points. But they're still better at range, which again, it's a little weird. I wish the Thoricatai upgrade would also bump them to at least either +2 on melee or the second melee dice or something. So they're still a little bit weak overall on the combat side, but the armor and the little bit of parry action they can have can definitely help them last. And again, if you do upgrade to Thoricatai, they can sort of form a pseudo phalanx as well. So again, they're not going to be as good as the pikemen at that, just because the pikes are going to be a little bit better than the spears. But nonetheless, you have kind of like a little jack of all trades kind of unit that can accomplish multiple different things. But again, if you're going to rely on these guys on winning fights, you're going to either need the numbers or just be really, really careful and use them wisely. So again, only +1 melee and 1 melee dice apiece is not that scary. Can they deal with light infantry, basically about at their level, or like skirmishers or weaker infantry? Absolutely. But again, we saw with some of the other armies we've looked at, a lot of other light units. Some of those still have 2 melee dice, or they have +2 melee but only 1 dice or something like that. So in some ways, those other units are still a little bit better at fighting, but they don't necessarily come with the armor. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Not so much in the fighting ability, but the potential to have that extra armor could be really cool too. So have not used these guys myself yet, but I can definitely see different applications for them. I do have a unit that is waiting to get built, so definitely something to consider there. And if you thought that was it for Macedonia, oh no, but wait, there's more. So you have access to a war elephant, clocks in at 250 denarii. And again, that's just for one elephant. It's not a unit of multiple elephants. Move 6, range +1, melee +2, 6 melee dice. Agility is at a -1. Again, you're not really dodging things with this giant elephant. Bravery +1, armor's +2, 16 wounds. Yes, that is correct. 16 wounds. So its equipment, really colorful here. So tusks and a foul attitude counts as lethal 3 with smasher. So if you're hitting with this thing, it's definitely going to do some crazy damage, and the elephant does not care about your parries. So you can make it even more expensive by adding a turret, which, again, I need to do a little bit more testing, but the turret definitely adds some interesting options there. And it comes with a whole boatload of special rules, too. So big but cowardly. So if the elephant loses a quarter or more of its remaining wounds in a single turn, it must make a bravery check. If it fails, it performs 2 move actions in its next phase, moving directly away from the unit that caused the loss of the wounds, as far as possible, fleeing combat if necessary. If this move takes the elephant into contact with another unit, whether it's friend or foe, that will count as a melee action and a charge. So you could potentially hurt your own guys with this. At the end of the next phase, the war elephant must make another bravery check. If it's successful, it'll act normally. If not, it'll carry on moving away excuse me, from the last unit that caused it to lose wounds, taking another bravery check, etc., etc. So, and yeah, you might lose a quarter of your wounds. So, if you're at full wounds there, 16, you'd have to lose 4 in a single turn, which, it's certainly possible, and you got to be really careful with these units. You only have that armor +2, which, again, I wish it was maybe +3, but I feel like at that point it'd probably be virtually impossible to take these down reliably. But nonetheless, that big but cowardly thing is certainly a thing to factor in, depending on where you position that in your army, and depending on how you have it lined up and where the enemy's attacking you from. If you're forced to run into another one of their units as a result of running away, you get basically a free charge out of it, so that can be cool too. And again, 6 dice with lethal 3 smasher, and you're hitting on 4s. You can definitely cause some chaos there. It is also a terror weapon, and that is basically any unit charged by a war elephant must make an immediate will to fight check. Cavalry unit charged by a war elephant must re-roll this check if it passes the first time, unless it is also a war elephant. So you can definitely get a little bit more use out of it there, and sticking it where the enemy maybe has some weaker units too, where they will be more likely to fail those will to fight checks. Then the turret upgrade itself is pretty cool. You get actually a whole lot for 25 points here. A war elephant equipped with a turret has a handful of warriors riding it, equipped with bows and javelins, which they use to rain missiles down upon enemies. Also a spearman here as far as the picture is concerned, but we won't mention that anymore. So long as the war elephant is not in close combat, it gains a free shooting action every phase, during which it can make 2 attacks with either bows or javelins. So technically you've always got a third action with it. So 2 free bow shots is pretty cool, but again, only range +1. I feel like if you're in the range, it's going to be javelins, basically. And as it says, it carries enough javelins to last the entire battle. So this is kind of like your mobile javelin delivery system. And just being able to throw 2 of those every turn for free before you do anything else, or it's not going to take away from your normal actions. That's actually pretty cool. Now, as is pictured and modeled here, again, the reason I mentioned maybe having +3 armor would be cool for this thing is, again, if you look at it, there's really not much that isn't covered by armor here, except for maybe the neck, really, and the underside. So from that point, +3 armor would be cool. But again, needs some more testing to see how survivable and durable these things really are, and how much damage they're really going to take in a turn. It would be cool if, aside from the 2 free bow shots or javelins here, you could make an extra spear attack or something like that with the other guy that's up there. But that's just a minor gripe. Overall, really cool, colorful unit. But certainly for bigger games, again, 250 base denarii is a serious chunk of points. And then on the mercenary side, you do have quite a bit of access here. So you can take from Athens, Persia, basically representing after Alexander conquered it, and Thebes as well. Sparta's not on there for historical reasons, which if you don't know the story behind that, definitely worth your time to look it up. In addition, you have access to basically some of the best the Greek world has in mercenaries there. So Cretan archers, again, just cream of the crop there. You have Greek mercenary hoplites, which are pretty cool, but again, you already have similar units, basically via the Thurio-Phori or Thorcatai, so questionable on wanting to take those. Thessalian cavalrymen are awesome light cavalry, and you get Thracian peltasts, which are basically just better versions of your peltast by far, and Thracian warriors, another solid unit there. So really cool stuff there for the Macedonians. Then we move on to our special characters, which we have Hephaestion, Philip, and then the young Alexander. So I imagine down the road we'll get some other heroes here, because there certainly were many other Macedonian heroes and famous people. And certainly maybe even a more seasoned version of Alexander would be cool to see too. But anyway, Hephaestion clocks in at 155 points. It's almost like a little budget Alexander. He's definitely basically him and Alexander are your cavalry heroes, and then Philip is the infantry guy. So he's only a level 4 hero, but he's got +3 ranged. For his one javelin that he has. Melee +2, 3 dice, 2 agility, 3 bravery, 3 armor, and 4 wounds. 155 denarii again. He's got Buckle, the Line, Galloping Thunder, Horsemanship, Inspire, Voice of Command, and his equipment is the Horse, Javelin, Linothorax, and Sword, so no shield or anything like that for him. His ability's kind of cool, but he's Evasion's not really geared for like surviving any like duels with heroes really, or certainly not a hero geared for close combat. But basically, if a friendly hero within 12 is challenged, Hephaestion may immediately move into contact with the hero and accept the challenge instead. So I guess if you have another hero who wants, you don't want to die, Hephaestion basically can bite the bullet instead. But again, he's not really geared for close combat so much. Buckle, the Line, basically an enemy will take a bravery check, and if they fail it, they're -1 melee for that fight phase. And the cool part with that, and Alexander has this too, is it will nullify phalanx rules until the end of the turn. So it doesn't work on Shield Wall or Testudo or anything like that, but when dealing with other Greek armies, pretty cool ability. Galloping Thunder, enemies at -1 melee when you charge, so different ability there, but similar. Horsemanship, basically, so cavalry can do a free double move once per turn. With this, you pass a bravery check and you can do another double move. So cavalry can effectively move 4 times the normal value listed in increments of basically 2 by 12. So really cool there. And that will, again, get those cavalry to where they need to be. Then we've got Inspire, so basically friendly units within 12 will reroll Will to Fight. Again, feel like a couple of these could have been changed out for him to have a little bit more combat ability. And then Voice of Command, friendly units within 6 of him get +1 Bravery. So again, those last 2 abilities are geared more towards... I would say Hephaestion was like one of the generals, I think, but still, those 2 abilities I feel like would be better on like a different style of hero. He really doesn't have anything that distinguishes him in combat, and only having 1 javelin. I mean, his range +3, that's great and all, but you throw that 1 javelin, great, that was it for the whole game. So hopefully that shot gets through and it counts. But that is Hephaestion. Philip, on the other hand, is pretty dang cool too. Only 150 denarii, so you actually get quite a bit here. Range 1, melee 3, 3 dice. I feel like he could have maybe even had 4. Agility's 2, bravery's 3. Again, I feel like his bravery could have even been a little bit better, since Philip really is the one responsible for reforming Macedonia. No armor to start with here, although, again, he's listed as having Linothorax, so sometimes they put it on there, sometimes they don't. And he's only got 5 wounds. He's got... kind of a oddly low amount of talents too. Some heroes seem to have a little bit more that we've seen, but we'll go through those anyway. He does have a large shield, which is again cool, being an infantry hero there. Linothorax and a long spear and a sword. And his ability is pretty neat too. Almost destined for greatness. So whenever he loses a wound on a 5-up, he can just straight up ignore it. So really cool. So if you're rolling hot, that 5 wounds can really stretch even longer. So about face, basically, again, he is your infantry hero, so he's going to be sort of buffing your cavalry, or not your cavalry, your pike units. So basically, whenever he's not in contact and your unit is in phalanx, they basically can turn their facing, which normally a phalanx couldn't do, but and you basically don't have to worry about that until the end of the turn. But the next turn, you basically have to obey the rules for phalanx again, otherwise the phalanx is broken. So depending on the size of the unit and stuff that you apply that to, that can take the normally sort of inflexible phalanx and actually allow you to sort of surprise your opponent by being able to reform and move it in surprising ways. He's got Inspire, which again is that friendlies within 12 reroll all Will to Fight. That seems certainly appropriate. He's got Heroic Rush, basically 3 actions once per game. I feel like Hephaestion could have benefited from that as well. He's got Mighty Blow, which seems pretty colorful too for him. So only one attack, but it will cause 3 times the wounds and a potential knockdown. And he's got Pushback, which is a really cool ability again for him being an infantry hero with the enemy. But his side gets a +1 bonus for every 5 models that he has. And then basically they push the enemy back an inch and then follow it up with basically the actual rest of the combat. But the enemy doesn't get use of their shields for that particular phase. So that can really just, drastically reduce the parries that you're going to have to deal with and let you push that much more damage through. So really, really cool ability there. And then that's basically it. Yeah, you might expect that, the guy that reformed Macedonia, and if it weren't for his untimely death or assassination, would have gone on to great things as well, or greater things. So I feel like certainly, even if his point cost had to go up a little bit, I feel like he is a little bit not undervalued, but certainly not as useful as he potentially could be. His special ability is pretty cool, but maybe something along the lines of his ability to sort of, again, reform Macedonia and sort of dominate and conquer the rest of the Greek world. So some more sort of battlefield control-ish type abilities would have been really useful for him there. Stat-wise, he's more or less fine. Again, pretty solid across the board, nothing crazy. So I really just feel like it's a question on the talents there, and same thing for kind of Hephaestion. But Hephaestion again is clearly a cavalry hero, and then Philip is definitely your sort of massed infantry leader there. And then we finally move on to the man himself, the young Alexander. So presumably at some point we'll get like a not necessarily old Alexander, because Alexander died when he was 33, but maybe a more seasoned Alexander after he's conquered Persia. So, but Alexander is pretty badass. But even with him, there are some maybe some questionable talents and stuff like that. But we can probably forgive that just because again, this is more the young Alexander. But 205 denarii, only range 1. Again, Alexander's not throwing missiles or anything. Some of his stats are absolutely badass though. Melee +4, 3 dice. +2 agility, +4 bravery, +4 on the armor side, and 5 wounds. He's got a really good number of abilities, or talents, I should say, but again, even some of those could be tweaked slightly. Blessed at Birth, Buckle of the Line, Divine Luck, Galloping Thunder, Horsemanship, Voice of Command, and Wall of Iron. So basically, he's got all the things that Hephaestion has. He doesn't have Inspire, though, which you would think, whether it's young Alexander or older Alexander, he might be, kind of an inspirational figure, but that'll be a conversation for a different video, I think. Equipment side is horse, linothorax, long spear, and sword. And Alexander's ability is basically a much better version of Philip's, where he was actually destined for greatness. So when he loses a wound on a 3-up, he ignores it, which is absolutely amazing. So as long as you're doing well on that roll, you could, put an asterisk next to that 5 wounds, because Alexander might just live on forever and ever. So as long as your dice are hot, Alexander's practically immortal. So Blessed at Birth, again, that one is interesting because normally in like campaign play, that's for when you like get a level 1 hero. But the ability, the talent basically lets you raise 1 characteristic when the hero is purchased. So the way I would imagine that is when you decide to actually use Alexander, you get to buff one of his stats of your choice. So obviously any of the +4s is probably not the one, so I would probably just go with the melee dice if that is a thing like that. So just having 4s across the board there for the most part is really good. You could also go with that extra wound, but I feel like the more damage you can cause with Alexander, the better. So we have that one. Buckle of the Line again. Basically a chance to, when you charge with your cavalry unit, the enemy, if they fail their bravery check, they're at -1 melee, and you can also nullify phalanxes for a phase. Divine Luck is basically he gets like 1 reroll of any dice during the battle. So, which again, he might save for his Destined for Greatness there. So just to have that little extra protection on keeping him alive. I feel like there he could have probably had, maybe even 2 of those or something, but again, might be even too much. Again, with his Destined for Greatness, he might just, if you're rolling hot, you might just not actually cause him any the enemy might not cause him any damage. So maybe too much of the divine luck would be overpowered there. Galloping Thunder, again, enemies at -1 melee when you charge. Horsemanship, again, is that extra double move. And with his bravery, you're basically going to be getting that every turn. Voice of Command is pretty good. Again, friendlies within 6 inches of him get +1 bravery. And then he's got Wall of Iron, which gives him an extra parry with the sword, which is cool. Definitely, like, really the only like close combat ability out of the 3 heroes here. You would feel like again, it feels like he just needs like a little extra something to cause damage, but he's more, he's almost more just of a like a support hero here who can definitely cause some damage, and will his stats definitely speak more than his talents here for the most part. But him in a cavalry unit is definitely going to be brutal. So between him and Hephaestion, I feel like putting them both in the same unit might just be overkill. But between the two, Alexander really would never die, because you could have Hephaestion eat a challenge for you while Alexander is doing damage to the rest of the unit and stuff like that. So there's all kinds of things to consider here for different game sizes and all that stuff. But again, this is just the young Alexander, so we got to kind of wait and see if Warlord will have an expansion down the road where maybe we get the more seasoned and accomplished Alexander the Great, actually, who probably will then go up in denarii cost as well. But in either case, so that's been the Macedonians. Really cool army, really diverse set of units, wide range of tactics and stuff possible. Fun army to collect and paint as well. So, and you get a little bit of, you got melee, you got the ranged, you got really awesome cavalry, some pretty neat heroes too, and the first of the armies that we see that also has access to an elephant. So, so if you guys like that video, give us a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and then stay tuned for more SPQR.